Good afternoon. So we're from the tail end of the group, obviously, focusing on an area comprised largely of stilt and boathouses, obviously being much more an on-water environment. At the beginning of our discussion, we talked somewhat about other environments that are similar that have adapted to more modern ways of living, such as Georgetown in Malaysia, where there are on-water villages that, while appeal to tourists, are still very active and vibrant communities. And there are the boathouse where they live, and outside that there are more industrial areas where they actually have their active fishing boats and go out and live and work on water. Very similar to the problems you highlighted was a lack of sort of connection between the land and the river. And so in narrowing it down, we wanted to create a clear, a clean and a safe environment for the people of the area, which would obviously foster a greater sort of degree of pride in the environment and a greater standard of living for the people as well as the public. So this public aspect was very much in a similar solution of creating walkways. We were thinking floating pontoons, which would perhaps be incorporated into the houses somehow. They already exist on pylons. If there was some way to make these more permanent and upgrade them and incorporate sort of the semi-private, semi-public spaces that you mentioned. And the 2 points of that were, one was to create a much more of a visual connection between the land and the river, which would, because at the moment it's quite an impasse. You are on the land, and as Paul mentioned, it's very tidy and it's great, and then you can't see the river, and when you do see the river, it's very what's the word? Like it's quite it surprises you, and it's not in such a good way. You don't come upon it from far away, and you don't have an interaction with it. You are suddenly upon a rickety walkway, and it's right below you, and it's very confronting. So what we were thinking is much more, larger open systems while working within the existing housing that would lead perhaps to a more of a plaza type, larger floating pontoon on river, which obviously is quite feasible. I mean, you could use, you can build it, but obviously there's a technology to do that very easily. Barges and such already exist to those sizes. And it was that idea, I guess, of incorporating the river and the land, and giving the people who then live in that environment greater access to a more utilitarian space, because there will be more public moving amongst it, and obviously people who are on river in boats can then use those larger spaces, and people who live in the house can, I guess the most comparable idea is kind of like the shop house style, where the bottom floor where it is a much more fluid space and a much more adaptable space. And so, as opposed to being simply the abodes of people who live in that environment without much connection for the public, whether from the land or the water, it is a space that is much more liminal. And that's the essence of our solution.
Can you tell me, is it our house concept? Yeah. It's our house in detail. Yeah. And you see that we got the wonton in here, the river, the dam, and the houses with the mezzanine and the ground floor. Well, we can be trained in the flooding season and the dry season also. So it's in detail.
Great. So how does the house fit on what you've got on the sheet of paper there?
Well, yes, the house was more of a working detail at the moment, but this is the issue of feasibility here, is that, ideally it could be something where you would perhaps upgrade to, if you had the funds and the reason and the ability to do it, to perhaps concrete pylons that would, if possible, raise the houses, or this is the part where, we haven't quite figured out yet, but to create a sort of a permanent base from which the houses on top are much more adaptable. And so almost like a, what do you call it, like a jetty, but like a, just something like, it'd be almost quite modular, where you sort of have some ponds that are quite, yeah, that's sort of where we were at with getting to the details. Sorry, go on.
Did you put that house where on that slope? Does it fit on that slope?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, that's the idea, definitely.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, it's the idea as well as rivers, I mean, outward looking, but it then brings people looking like inwards at the, from on river. It's connected there. Yeah.
I've got a tough question for you. This area, I think, this area has large factories, and if they're taken away, that will leave big areas of land for redevelopment. Yeah. So would you put a lot of small houses, or would you have large houses, hotels?
I think ideally, I mean, to maintain, you know, you want to sort of adapt the existing houses, whether, you know, in such a way that if not the actual houses are, you know, renovated, you know, maintain themselves or renovated in such a way to make them more permanent and viable, in a way that sort of preserves the essence of the area and that floating markets and the waterfront communities. And, you know, perhaps you would think that any additions would be quite sympathetic to that.
I have a question for Mr. Tom on this. Is there any chance that you can keep the factory floor space and change the use of the buildings into something else? Okay.
We have a chance if we have a good idea and the government accept it. Yeah. And we give the just floor.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes we give some factory down.
Structure the factory and
I just say the first one. Yeah. Some factory that have a culture of I think I think
traditional products, agricultural products, local products,
Yeah.
you can sell and,
Yes.
and change the function of the factory, right?
Yeah, most definitely. And like you look at, I don't know, places like that, like in Malaysia, and even sort of some of the developments around Newfoundland, like the powerhouse, where, you know, the existing shell obviously is kept and, you know, worked with in such a way to benefit not the local community, but also something that tourists would want to visit as well.
We kind of, with, you know how you're talking about the sizing of the houses, making them bigger or smaller, one of the things that we observed was the houses were a really comfortable size for the people there. They were, because the families are about 4 living in these houses, and we all, like, thought they were, I think that we expected more people to be in each home.
Okay.
So.
In this side, we have the traditional handicraft at the boat building. So we can transfer one factory with the boat building workshop and to like a gathering all the boat building workshop, and the tourists can come and see how the carpenter, local carpenter build up the boat by hand and
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds great.
I have one question. Yeah. I must go there.
Okay.
The house. This house is actually existing.
yeah, current condition.
Current condition or new design? Or your new idea?
Your idea is just about the balcony and have the floor, the outside.
Yeah, I just noticed one thing. The reason the floating market is very ugly. Yeah, there are a lot of rust just because the column. Yeah, because when the water down, yeah, there are a lot of ugly spray here. Yeah, then the people put the rust bit here. Yeah, when it's the water come out, yeah, we haven't got anything to left with the water, the level of the water. Yeah, you must thinking about that.
We in looking at it, we did look at if it was possible to replace with concrete pylons or something more permanent to perhaps, because they're stronger, also increase the space between the pylons so there's much more water flow through the area, and that would flush it out a lot more, and as well increase the height of the houses to protect them from the floods, as well as, yes, keep it a more open space so it's less things to happen.
I just love it, yeah.
Yeah.
But I go far, you push more than me.
Okay, any questions?
Thanks very much.
Thank you.